After the release of the Night Dive Quake remaster, it was a relief to see that it wasn't just going to be left as is. As nice as it was, the subsequent release of add-on content, handily available through the main menu, has probably made it a heck of a lot easier for people to get a taste of the wider world of custom content available for Quake. In that regard, I've already covered the likes of Dimension of the Machine and Honey back when they were fresh releases, but this most recent one, I feel like it might need a little bit of context. For starters, Slave Zero X episode Enyo is a prequel to a prequel. If the name sounds familiar to some of you out there, then that will be because the patient zero of this particular chain, the original, is Slave Zero. Slave Zero was an accolade-developed third-person biomechanical mech suit blast-em-up, originally released at the tail end of the old millennium for the Sega Dreamcast and for Windows 95 and 98. I hadn't played it myself back in the day, but I'd certainly seen the box art kicking around. Apparently you can still bag it in current year via several services of choice. Personally, I went for the GOG version, considering it seemed to be the most stable right out of the install. For a game released back in '99, Slave Zero is still a heck of a lot of fun. It is a completely unpretentious run-and-gun mech game that has a surprisingly good grasp on how hefty a 60-foot-tall biomech should feel, and reminds you of the scale of everything with teeny little cars zipping around your feet. Teeny cars that I might add you can pick up and launch right at your enemies. Same goes for humans, even though they're not all that particularly great as a projectile material. Kinda squishy. Either way, an easy recommend if you're in the mood for a bit of mindless mecha action. As for the next link in the chain, however, Slave Zero X surprisingly switches genre entirely, ditching the 60-foot-tall biomech and slapping you instead into a much more human-scaled biosuit in a 2.5D retro-styled brawler. Funnily enough, this game isn't actually officially released yet, although a demo is available at time of making this video. For some reason it's stuck at 720p windowed resolution, couldn't change it for the life of me, but even then it managed to lend some additional authenticity to its lo-fi PSX era visuals. Quite enjoyed the more anime-esque stylized sprites for both my character and the antagonists, and in terms of gameplay, it's about as much of a throwback as it sounds. Surprisingly difficult and pretty lengthy for a demo. Half expected to finish it after the first quite punishing boss encounter, but no, it just kept on going. In any case, this leads us in totality back to the actual subject of this video, that being Slave Zero X episode Enyo, a free custom campaign for Quake that's not only playable throughout your source port of choice, but also handily downloaded direct from the Quake remaster menu itself. Shifting genre once more into a straight-up old-school FPS, episode Enyo sees you take the mantle of the eponymous Enyo herself, an assassin carving through a 6-level in total campaign that impressively translates the look of the 2.5D levels and the sprite-based enemies of Slave Zero X into much more rounded, polygonally complex forms. Story-wise, there's honestly not a lot to go on. Enyo seems to have a bone to pick with the forces of the Sovereign Khan, the big bad of Slave Zero in general, and in turn they don't seem to like you all that much either. Have to admit that from the get-go, episode Enyo impressed me. Pretty much all custom everything here with regards to textures, enemy design, weapons, music, heck, even the skyboxes, which, believe me, further on get surprisingly trippy. That said, before you can ogle said sky, episode Enyo kicks you off in the darkened industrial depths of the megacity. Just because it's the opening level, however, don't expect episode Enyo to go easy on you. Once it's swiftly replaced your mule with the Gemini submachine guns and buttered you up with a few softball encounters, it swiftly shoves a wonderfully spiky Neo Tanegashima shotgun in your hands and takes away the training wheels. This level alone seems to introduce you to at least a half-dozen enemy types out of the 13 total of the roster, and man, do some of them look cool as all heck. Particularly a fan of the grenade-throwing lieutenant here, straddling the line somewhere between a member of the Jinro Wolf Brigade and maybe something out of 40k. I mean, that cape is just straight up style, and woe betide if you get close enough to him, because then he's just gonna take a swipe at you with his baller as fuck sword. This opening level isn't averse to the occasional ambush either, making ample use of lesser enemy types such as these club-wielding grunts, either sneakily placed around blind corners or just straight up descending on you like a flock of seagulls in this section, which happily balances things out by blessing you with a quad damage to return the aggression. Nice bit of personality too, with many enemies featuring their own distinct voice lines, lesser types ordering you to drop your weapon, whereas the beefier, higher rank enemies will address you with all the prestige of their station by just simply addressing you as scum. Enyo has a few choice lines all her own too, and they're delivered in a wonderfully maniacal fashion.
Beloved by the bullet.
All in all, a pretty fun introduction as far as first levels go, one that will adequately prime you for the seemingly relentless nature of combat going forward. Not to mention encounters with these big buff orange things. Second map brings you up to street level and starts to introduce a bit more verticality to the proceedings, while also introducing you to the Iron Angel grenade launcher and the Solar Cobra rifle. The former doing pretty standard grenade launcher things in a chunky red package, while the Solar Cobra rifle spits high damage energy projectiles that are often tempered with a limit on the available ammo in your immediate area. The big thing that certainly stood out for me here, though, was the lack of explosive barrels. I was absolutely primed for several things during the course of these levels to explode, but they just never did. This map gets, honestly, really heated towards its midpoint, crossing over to this adjacent street where it absolutely piles on the lower tier enemies on the ground while harassing you with explosives from higher perches. A recurring theme that you'll see return in latter levels. Fighting my way around here, I also realized that I have a katana in my arsenal. Also happens to not really be all that great, save for some dire situations where you're absolutely out of everything else. And I was hoping it would do something cool, like projectile deflection, but sadly not. A man can dream. Regardless, if this map wasn't content enough with giving you access to a grenade launcher, if you take a diversion across this rooftop onto the elevated track here, you'll be able to bag yourself the Mike rocket platform? I'm guessing it's supposed to be pronounced Mike, but you never know. It could have been developed by a guy called Mike. Megacity's a big place. There's got to be a Mike somewhere. Maybe even a Greg. In terms of effectiveness, however, the Mike is honestly kind of weedy feeling, which is kind of galling considering it does a double volley with each pull of the trigger. Lower enemies do indeed jib, but I was hoping for a similar effect when it came to the bigger kahunas. Speaking of which, a few of them appear after a few ambushes littering the path to the upper levels here, and an even bigger kahuna drops just before the exit. In terms of attack, it's pretty much Slave Zero X's version of the Shambler. Though I freely admit, a lightning scythe is pretty damn cool. Oh hey, remember the trippy skyboxes I mentioned earlier? Well, this here level is where they start making themselves known. Can't help but feel like there's a bit of a disconnect though between the immediate environment and what you can see in the sky. But you never know when it comes to whatever internal lore Slave Zero X has that could be entirely intentional. It's a pretty swift level, all things considered. Pretty much episode Enyo hitting its groove when it comes to its combat encounters and level design, but for the sake of spicing things up, this one also introduces you to the Vajra railgun. Now anyone who knows me can tell you, I loves me a good railgun. Even better when it's got a pretty spiffy design. For sake of reference, the Quake 2 railgun is the GOAT in my own personal opinion. Yes, we can also bring the Quake 3 railgun along if you feel like it, but when I say the Vajra is up there in terms of railguns, I mean it. Yes, it is largely because it spins after every shot, but you cannot deny that that is pretty effing cool. I just wish the ammo was more plentiful. It's worth mentioning that episode Enyo is also pretty generous with making sure that the verticality of its level design isn't too painful when you do inevitably fall off a ledge. Shortcut elevators often open up during the course of your travels, and on the subject of shortcuts themselves, there's a handful here and there that I'm sure let you just circumvent straight up chunks of the map. It's a good way of rewarding exploration, and also breaking up any potential feel of linearity. If there's one thing I will hold against this map, however, is that it's got one of those brick shithouse lightning scythe fellas right by the exit here, and doesn't give you any decent cover. Absolute bastard of an enemy placement, and I guess it's not all that different from the traditional trolling in a standard Quake map where you get an exit shambler. Fuck you. Next two maps take the action firmly indoors, the first of which still manages to maintain a bit of freedom of movement, what with its ultra-wide corridors. It's also got generously placed piping and crates allowing you to take cover when necessary, and considering the number of lightning scythe enemies during this, it will indeed be necessary. The hairiest this one probably got for me was the concentration of enemies during this particular section, not to mention making it across the piping. But even then, the fact that there was solid ground beneath and not a death pit reassured me that even failure was going to be relatively easy to recover from. All things considered, it feels much like a short and sweet warm-up act when compared to the follow-up. This here map just has much more effective application of pressure, not just from the more claustrophobic nature of its connective hallways, but also the much more aggressive enemy encounters, I guess befitting of its status as penultimate map. Lots of high-perch nade spam to deal with here as you make your way through, though happily some of the edge is taken off thanks to an early acquisition of quad damage and another instance of melee grunts and their big brothers thinking they're hot shit in a champagne glass, when really they're just cold diarrhea in a Dixie cup. It's a much more complex feeling level in comparison to its predecessor. Its larger central area here requiring you to circle back to it a few times after picking up a few successive keycards. The first journey will take you on an elevated route, dealing with those aforementioned high-perch nade spammers among other elevated enemies, before setting you on a path of intense encounters, crisscrossing your way across until you reach this here chasm, which I'm sorry to say I did indeed manage to fall into. Thankfully, this map gets points for it not being a straight-up death drop, teleporting you instead back to a safe ledge where you can think about what you've done and maybe not suck so much next time. Anyways, once you've picked up the blue keycard and dealt with the ambush of enemies that ensues, you can head back over to that central room and find yourself greeted with a warm reception of several lieutenants and the backup squad. Happily, it turns into a good opportunity to make use of the heavier weapons in your loadout before finding yourself lured in this lower section towards a quad damage that drops you down into a multiple wave combat arena. You'd think having the quad damage down here might trivialize the challenge somewhat, but each wave essentially becomes a race to take out the biggest threats in the room before it wears off and you find yourself overwhelmed by numbers. Good shit. As it happens, this level has a few more surprises up its sleeve, as it decides this is a great time to introduce a flight power-up, seeing you pump the jump key to flap yourself higher, and honestly, it's fairly unwieldy, but necessary practice considering it becomes pretty integral to the episode's final map. Before we get there, however, it's back to that central chamber so you can put those ammo reserves to work. Just make sure you hold on to some of it for when you open the yellow keycard door. And so, here we finally are. Where exactly? Well, it appears to be some kind of HR Giga adjacent techno hellscape. Either way, looking at it makes my stomach feel weird. Oh, by the way, that previously mentioned flight power-up, you'll be making good use of it as you cross these platforms heading towards that ominous central tower that seems to periodically make the entire world shake. No enemies to speak of here, but the start of the level gives you a pretty generous resupply of your arsenal, which can only mean one thing. Oh boy, that's right. Time for a boss fight! So Big Red in the middle here is Slave Alpha, and guess what? Your guns do precisely jack and shit, but hey, at least they're still effective against the regular enemies that'll continuously spawn in. So how do you even deal with this thing? Well, that's where the flight power-up comes in handy. You'll need to ascend the chamber up to its highest levels and take out the 4 shoot switches at the top to deal a lightning strike to Slave Alpha itself. Problem is, you gotta do this from the bottom every single time in order to hit a switch, and oh god, pumping that jump button just to get yourself onto a ledge is the most finicky goddamn thing. Either way, all jank aside, got it done. Slave Alpha dead, exit open, here lies the end of episode Enyo. Gotta admit, genuinely surprised with how fun episode Enyo turned out to be. If anything, it feels like this could have easily been spun out into a full-fledged boom shoot all of its own, but no, here it is as a free add-on campaign for Quake. It seems like a heck of a lot of effort to go to in terms of raising awareness for a game of a completely different genre, itself spinning off from a several-decade-old original, but hey, I'm not complaining when the results are this good. It's genuinely interesting to me how episode Enyo has retooled familiar Quake elements and spun it into something that feels a little bit more unique to itself. I just think it's cool what you can do with Quake when you put a fresh coat of paint over everything. When you just add a little bit of extra flair here and there, you can convince yourself it is something entirely different when it is in fact utilizing a lot of very familiar Quake elements, especially when you get down into the enemy types and the attacks that they utilize. All in all, I'd easily say that this was a heck of a lot of fun. Played it on normal difficulty, it was a reasonable amount of challenge, and if the intent was to get the word out about Slave Zero X, it certainly worked on me. Enough to go and play the goddamn original and check out the demo, so whoever had that bright idea probably deserves a raise. Either way, I hope you've enjoyed this run-through of Slave Zero X episode Enyo. Feel free to let me know what you thought in the comments, and if you'd like to support the channel, why not consider checking out my Patreon and joining this list of esteemed names scrolling up the screen. Till next time, this has been Mr. Icarus. Thank you very much for watching. Icarus out.